All right, Steve, take it away.
Well, I'm Steve Prevette. Right now, I'm in Graniteville, South Carolina. This layout has actually been to all four corners of the United States, from Maine to Florida to Washington State to California, and now in South Carolina. Uh, Burnt Hills and Big Flats, cutesy name. I chose it when I was 10 years old, so 53 years later, I'm still using it. But it kind of morphed into the New York, Ontario, and Western in 1970, and my assumption is that this remnant of the O&W is part of Derico with Erie, Lackawanna, and Delaware and Hudson, my two favorite railroads, so I don't have to repaint my locomotives. I do have some BH and BF locomotives, but at this point, as you can see, I've got a Lackawanna and an Erie leading the train over the Delaware River Bridge. All right, but we're going to talk about rocks and water. So I thought that was a good picture for water. I'm just trying to figure out how to get this to advance. Oh, there we go. Whoops, went too far. This has been around. Eric did say, I think I wrote an article on this in the OPSIG magazine. So I've given this a bit of an update. Now, what I'm looking at here is flow. How do things flow on your railroad? And I do want to give credit, and there's the latest book out from on Alan McClelland, may rest in peace. I took a lot of inspiration from the Virginian in Ohio and his writings for this. So a lot of this is the system. I'm an operations researcher and worked a lot of statistics. Actually had a headhunter contact me, said he had an operations research job in Dallas, and come to find out he was trying to recruit me for the BNSF. So I'm like, I don't know if I could actually professionally write operating sessions and also have a hobby. But it was paying less than nuclear paid me. So there you go. I do want to give credit to, there is a philosopher out there about rock logic and water logic. So he has some very interesting thoughts that I thought fit in with model railroad design. Edward de Bono. So often we look at the rocks. We have the layout design elements that Tony Custer pushes. It's not a bad idea, but we tend to go, okay, let's plunk this scene here, this scene here, this scene here, this scene here. But how does the flow go? Not the rocks, but the flow between the rocks. Kind of an interesting about water filling a pool, if you work with scenery much. But we'll expand on this as we talk about the real railroads. Don't really get paid for moving people and things aimlessly around. Now, I will say there are two exceptions to that: tourist railroads and fan trips, and the Union Pacific. Just to give a little humorous story, I picked this up at the 2004 National. An engineer who worked for the UP said he took a 120-car train from Los Angeles to Fresno over the Tehachapi Loop, which is certainly a choke point to the Union Pacific. He stayed overnight, got called for a train that was going back to LA Yard, and he happened to walk the train and went, this is almost exactly the same train I took from LA Yard yesterday. What's the deal? Well, the train master then explained that, oh, great, give me the train master then explained that this what happened was LA Yard was clogged. They had to get the cars out of the yard. How much we talked about this on OPSIG. They were losing their bonuses for sending out trains. They grabbed 120 problem cars, threw a couple engines on them, and sent them over to Fresno to get rid of them, with a hope that by the time they came back to LA Yard, they'd be able to sort them. So kind of interesting things of modeling the prototype. And I lived in Pasco, Washington, where there was a BNSF engineer in our group, and he said on the back shift, they took the unit grain trains and ran them over the hump just so they could get the count for the cars that were sent over the hump for bonuses. So aside from that, we do want to simulate actual operations of the railroad. That's part of the Operation Special Interest Group. Part of this is getting your railroad on a map. So over the 50 years, I went from kind of a very fictitious railroad as a youngster, but I wanted upstate New York, to kind of landing on the New York, Ontario, and Western for inspiration. Another big point, and I've actually been in the John Allen basement long after the railroad was gone. I actually had two pieces of that railroad. I gave a piece to the guy who's building one in upstate New York that's supposed to be a copy of the Gory and Defeated. He had heard I had a piece of it. But what's my flow? And the Goring Defeated was somewhat weak. They had the car ferry in port, but there wasn't a lot of connections to the outside world. So what we're looking at is, as part of this don't wander around aimlessly, how do your layout design elements interact? This may be a nuclear nightmare here in terms of documentation. I'm sorry I wrote nuclear cleanup type of things and measured things, but this is a one end of the railroad. I'm actually in the railroad room, by the way. I'll just give you a quick, just to prove it. Here we go. So there is the railroad. And this, so I say, put your railroad on the map. This is plenty of maps right here. Does the mouse pick up there, Eric? The mouse arrow?
Yes, it does.
Okay, so I did put up a quick schematic. There's a map of the entire railroad for the person switching the actual town. There's the map of the towns and what the thumbtacks go to. I use tack on car. You'll see these little frisbees on top of the cars. I did find out people still couldn't read a schematic, so I took a photo and actually put on, okay, this is the Lehigh Valley trackage, this is Erie Lackawanna trackage, and actually overlaid on the photo where all this stuff is. Fan trips are fun. One thing I did find out, they sell a nickel plate 759 steam loco model, and in a picture I've got of the Erie Lackawanna, that locomotive was in Pennsylvania in June of 1970, so it's not impossible for it to have been on this trackage if it still existed. So I do run a Steamtown operating session. For those who really know Steamtown, that didn't exist till 1972, but oh well, this is 1970. So for flows, this is where we get more interesting for operations, is thinking of the yards as pools. I've been on railroads where the yards are just places to store cars, and you cherry pick and make up a train and send them out from some supply of cars in the yard. But actually the cars in the yard are in motion, and having an operations research degree, I actually asked my queuing theory professor about model railroad operations, and after some explanation, she actually gave me some actual statistical and operations research type of principles to use, which we'll actually delve into a little bit here. But when we talk about de Bono and rocks and water, is how much water are we trying to get through our stream? How much turbulence is there? I know there's always the discussions on the OPSIG about my yard is clogged. How do I prevent that? Well, if you have a big enough yard, now my yard holds 150 cars and there's only 400 on the railroad. So there's very rarely that the yard completely backs up, but I do try to sequence the trains through the yard so the train that's arriving has cars for trains that are leaving fairly quickly. So that's a pretty smooth, shall we say, laminar flow. Now, one of the problems is about flow is that the variability does not scale down. We try to run fast clocks, we compress our distances, but oddly enough, the variability of your traffic flow, if it's really generated randomly, blows up. And I'll cover that calculation that later. Having been a teenager in the 70s, read all the John Armstrong books and, looked at a lot of track plans that talked about point to point. I think we've all decided now that usually there's pure point to point that really doesn't connect anything is a problem. So having the connections to the outside world give us the chance to move sufficient traffic on the railroad, rather than just shuttling back and forth between two endpoint yards. Staging yards do represent where your trains go when they leave the modeled area. Alan McClellan was one of the first ones to come up with a staging. I'm sure there's people before him. John Armstrong incorporated at least loop-to-loop type of staging on his railroads. And there are other connections outside world. I simulate on my railroad, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different interchanges. with Northeast railroads. So there is a fair amount of traffic that comes and goes over there. I don't have a port or a car ferry, but I have been involved with model railroad clubs where we have had a car ferry that would simulate cars going across San Francisco Bay, for example. And again, giving credit to Alan McClelland. Now, there is the issue of continuous run, and I will say I've always had a continuous run on my N-scale railroads. There was an HO railroad I built that did not have a continuous run, but everything from the 3-foot by 6-foot original railroad to the current 20 by 30 had a continuous run built into it. Now, operating sessions, you never knew the continuous run was there, but the continuous run is helpful for, at the very least, running my track cleaner train around, which is always a challenge in N-scale. And that's a whole nother topic, is how to clean track. I've actually found, by the way, having used lens cleaner cloths for my glasses, when that stuff dries out, if you rub that over the rail, you'll think the rail looks clean, and you'll be surprised how much black gunk you get off the rail. And I'm like, so I always dry out my lens cleaner cloths after I use them, and use them to wipe on the track rail. Really cleans it up pretty good. But the continuous run is helpful when you have visitors, though, of course, if you try to do a continuous run in opera session, you know, train 1 meet train 2 3 times in Cados, you could get a little confusing after a bit. Now, I have always made my continuous run rather hidden, by removing scenery, or on other people's railroads, I've blocked them with cars or used a continuous run as an interchange or an industry. Former configuration, this was from the original presentation, was this little siding that went down to this power plant actually went through the power plant and became a continuous run connection from the backside. So you could actually run a train out of the power plant. Now, the way that was done was there actually was a dummy track there, but if you see the little flat hill there, a track actually went through that little flat hill and through the power plant to simulate I didn't do that as a loads in empties out, but to actually have that loop track available. And you could actually lift that little flap. I didn't take a picture of it. And there was a nice loop versus normal turnout control there with the warning don't touch, which didn't help much. So I finally put a protective cover over it, a la nuclear power plants and the scram switch. You have to lift the plastic cover in order to shut down the reactor. Now, I did actually about 4 years ago decide that the 1982 3x6 railroad was really showing its age, just like on the Gordian Defeated. I had my original layout as part of the railroad for years, and I kind of bit the bullet and removed it and replaced it with a much longer peninsula. Now, because it was originally a folded oval, I still had this arrangement where a track coming out from staging ran very parallel to a track heading to the other staging. So there was an actual interchange between New York, Ontario, and Western in Pennsylvania where they ran parallel, and there was a center track. So when W was on one side, D and H the other, and they had a center track with this sort of arrangement for exchanging cars. So I kept that, but at the other end, I put a crossover so that you could go from here and cross over and make a continuous run. Now, sometimes those tracks being close together have confused people. I try to tell them it's like a 3-lane passing highway. A bonus was I was able to, in this 3-track, run a track to a combination power plant and breaker. This is actually 2 sidings, with one with loads and one with empties. So if you're coming out of Sydney from the north and you're in Franklin, New York, when you switch this, it is Edison power. And when you have come out of Mayfield and are heading to the Cup House branch for servicing mines in the Lehigh Valley and the Erie Lackawanna, the track here is to Riverside Breaker. So it's kind of a little bit of a loads in, empties out. It's really added a lot to the operation. So I thought that worked out very well in the redesign of the track work. I see a few chats building up. Eric, I assume you'll holler if something interesting is being asked.
Yeah, we'll just, it's just some discussion. There's no questions. We'll hold
Oh,
it till
okay.
the end.
Okay. Now, notes about yards, and I am really passionate about yards. I actually did meet Andy Sporandio. I did operate in an op session where, of course, he was the yard master. But I'll just say yards are not for cherry picking. Actually, the biggest thing for new people about a yard is to understand is you are not making up trains. You're not. You are actually breaking down trains. And if you put those cars on the right tracks, you are then, as a result, making up trains. But there's nothing worse than coming to an op session, the whole yard is a shambles, because you would never get a shift turnover like that on a real railroad. It would be, okay, we got this train just came in, we didn't get to break it down yet, but all these tracks are sorted. So that's usually the way I start my operating session. Is there might be an inbound train that actually came in late in the last operating session. We just kill the power, pick up from where we left off, and you would break down that train. But your yard usually is in good shape when you start an operating session. And again, this is the flow, not the rocks, shall we say. This is the Central New Jersey interchange. This was actually on the 3 foot by 6 foot, the classification yard. And as the railroad grew, it was like, well, what do I do with it? And it became, by throwing the bridge on the backdrop, the Central New Jersey interchange. And if you notice, of course, here's a Central New Jersey car waiting to go in. Now, because I got rid of 3 by 6 about 5 years ago, the current arrangement is this, a little bit bigger. But again, we have the end of the main line with this 4-track yard going under the bridge for the Central New Jersey. I've actually had fairly good success going to Google Maps and getting street views of buildings. Over here is an actual Google map printout of the abandoned Central New Jersey station that was right across at the end of the O&W. So it's there. And then this is a fairly famous building in Scranton. I, of course, have the Dunder Mifflin plant, and I have the Welcome to Scranton sign there for the Scranton Expressway that was in the opening of the office. So there are interesting things with not a very expensive printer that you can do. And as I say, you have to be either do a lot of photo editing to backdate the street views, or just make sure you get a picture that has no modern automobiles in it, which I've been successful for in Walton, New York, to have some backdrop scenes where the road goes against this backdrop. Again, here, things to orientate yourself is a north to Mayfield sign. And also because I'm using thumbtacks on cars, what brown tacks go to what location within the trackage for the Central New Jersey. Okay, I talked about variability. Variability does not scale. Now, this is, if I make the assumption that every car is independent from every other, that I don't have blocks of cars, that I don't have unit trains. Now, of course, the railroads try to avoid that situation at all costs these days. So this is kind of a worst case scenario, but for most of us, we do our car cards that are independent from each other. You can always do blocks of cars, a mine block. Tony Custer would talk about that. One way bill is actually for 5 hopper cars. But assuming each car has an independent destination, and I use an Excel Markov chain generator that I wrote about in an OPSIG magazine to put my thumbtacks out, then you end up with a Poisson distribution, it's called. And basically with that, and for the nuclear guys, they know this, square root of the average is the standard deviation when you're counting nuclear decays. So as it works out very quickly, and not to bore you with too much Stats 101, which, by the way, I do teach statistics for the IT department at Southern Illinois University at Carbondale. And my project that my structured query language students have to write is a faked roster from the NMRA. I scramble people's names, but they have to do the processing of the NMRA roster as it comes in from headquarters and write the various queries that send them out to the divisions. So I do force my students to know a little bit about model railroading. But the point being is 95% of the traffic will range from be within 2 standard deviations of the average. Now, what that means is, let's say we have a prototype train of 121 cars. Square root of 121 is 11. 2 standard deviations is 22. So on any given day, at least 19 out of 20 days, that when this train needs to leave, there will be between 99 and 143 cars for that 121 car average train. Again, this is all loose cars, all are independent from each other, no real planning. So worst case scenario, and again, I try to avoid that so I can get cars through the yard. But with that, that's a plus or minus 20% length. So I need an excess surge of 20% for that train in the yard. Now, however, in a model, if I have a 16-car train, I know somebody will scream, oh, I run 60-car trains, but I'd say for most model railroads I've been on, 16 cars is about a max. A square root of 16 is 4, and 2 standard deviations in is 8 cars. So this means that a 16-car train will be from 8 cars to 24 cars long. That's plus or minus 50%. So I've got a whole lot more variability to deal with in my model yard. So not only do I have the challenges of scaling time because my distances are shortened, but my surges and dry ups can be really severe on a model railroad when I'm running these relatively short trains compared to the prototype. So my yards really have to be fine-tuned in order to adjust for that amount of variability. So there's your Stats 101 lesson for the day. So again, those implications affect my flow through the yard. So the yard is a holding pool for things and pipes coming in and coming out. I don't want to overfill that reservoir. Now, of course, the way you can deal with that, if I'm dealing with a yard that is overwhelmed and has these, oh my God, I've got, 50 cars for a 16-car train or something weird like that, we can do through blocks or through trains. I do actually roll some dice for some of my through trains. It says, okay, roll these dice. I have some modified dice, but depending on those are the number of through cars, and anything else then gets tacked for local traffic. So I do get a good sized train, but not as much variability because most of the train is through. Now, adding more sources of water and places for it to go always helps. I do know that we have moved from the old Colorado type of factory that wasn't much bigger than a boxcar that it was loading to we now make some pretty darn big industrial buildings or even steel mills or things like that. So having a siding that can hold a reasonable length of cars. I'm always surprised. I drive by, there's a food oil processing plant, using leftover deep fat fryer oils and stuff. They usually have a string of about 10 tank cars waiting to be loaded or unloaded, I take it, at that plant. It's for not a very big building. It'd be a good backdrop building. It's a very heavy current industry there. But having places for large blocks of cars to come and go help and treating them more as blocks of cars. Larger industries and of course interchange yards, staging, and car ferries and floats also help you get away from this single car movement type of thing. A little meat here is working up your schematic. This is a format I use on the back of my clipboards. I give people a small clipboard. And this at least gives you where the towns are, what sequence they are. I have to give the Dixie Rail guys or JRAG, they call them in Atlanta. I visit a few layouts and they'll use this format. So here's the grand scheme of things. So I kind of like the tall, narrow strip. But for my railroad, starting at the bottom of the roots of the trees are the Central New Jersey interchange I've talked about, and out on the Capouse branch, Taylor, heading through Hampton Yard to Taylor Yard for Scranton Division. I mean, to Taylor Yard, which is near where Steamtown is in Scranton. This is the Scranton division of the Burn Hills and Big Flats. And then heading also out to Sibley Junction, and that headed over to the large Coxton Yard that still exists, was Conrail, and I forgot who picked it up. It was Norfolk Southern or CSX. Then I have my main yard, Mayfield, which I have in yard limits. By the way, we've had a lot of yard limit discussions. I do want to point out, yes, I traditionally use Mayfield yard as yard limits. We all, there's a yard master, and yes, you at least, I figure you have walkie talkies. It's 1970. You can at least talk to the yard master and find out, okay, do you know where I'm going? And as you're hitting yard limits, which are fair ways away from the yard. So you can keep moving. Again, you don't stop at yard limits and ask for permission to enter, but you're coming in slow and at least, give the yard master heads up. One thing I also do is, at least either as a dispatcher, if I have an operator, the operator at Capouse Junction gives the yard operator, the yard master heads up, the train's inbound. And similarly, the Forest City operator, and this is almost a scale mile between there and there, gives Mayfield Yard a heads up they've got an inbound. But I do have this yard down here where things are very congested between the staging and about 2 coal breakers and also a General Electric plant. So that's just under yard limits. Now, there's no yard master per se, but I point out as the dispatcher, it's a free-for-all. There's the traffic, there's the trackage, have at it. You guys forgot how to get by each other when you're within yard limits. More useful up here is the Sydney yard. Again, we're dealing with an interchange of the D&H. It just was a nightmare for the dispatcher to say, well, which of these 3 tracks should you be on? So it just became, it's yard limits. A lot of locals stop in at Sydney and are swapping cars out at this unmanned Sydney yard. So a lot of operations there just before staging. And this is a few of the offline connections: the Delaware and Hudson, the Delhi branch, Delaware Northern, the Central New Jersey, Erie, Lackawanna, Lehigh Valley, and also this Northwest branch, which is a nice little starting switching area, and you can do a lot of work off of the line. In fact, it's a strange case for those who know the O&W. The real Northwest branch was a convoluted mess of hairpin curves and switchbacks, and mine's actually too darn straight. Let's see here. I just hit the advance. I think if I wait to, come on. There we go. One of the things I've designed a lot of operating sessions for clubs. I've gone to cardstock tabs for a lot of clubs that, were having trouble managing their car cards. I had one club actually pay for a hotel stay overnight for me, so I could kind of specify for them what would be a good op session. A lot of times I come to Club Layout and they've built this huge yard, or even worse, a huge passenger terminal at the end of a branch. And it's like, okay, what would draw the traffic into this yard? So in one case, the club that was in Tri-Cities, Washington, there was a passenger, 3 tracks for the passenger terminal, about 6 classification tracks, and was the end of a branch. So because nobody really had much passenger equipment, I've also found that true for clubs. I'm sure there's exceptions to that, but my personal experience is I see all these passenger terminal trackages that never get used. So the passenger terminal became an interchange of the Union Pacific, which was in the area. So those 3 tracks were staged with cuts of cars were coming in for the Union Pacific. They were classified into 6 sorting tracks. There were some local industries. So that solved the problem of what to do with that end of the line dead end branch. It no longer was a dead end. There also, and this is talked a lot about in some of the operations books, especially by Alan McClellan, talking about backhaul. So like, for example, cars don't go in a straight line. If I have a car coming from the Lehigh Valley and for some reason it's going to Scranton, it's got to go up to Mayfield, be classified to come back down to Scranton. And that just happens. Also, I've done this on some portable railroads, is that they're double track, but we just take out a track out of service and declare that's an interchange. So instead of being a crossover, it's actually an interchange track. And at least for purposes when we operate on the traveling railroad, we can declare that an interchange instead of just another double track area, plus forces you to run single track. And I just hit my, come on, give me the next slide here. There we go. Retrofitting interchanges, which I was kind of describing again, the yard at the end of the branch, the unused passenger terminal. For in my case, the original 3-track classification yard for the 3x6 became eventually interchange, and just any old stub track that you extend to the backdrop. Easy to repurpose some of this excess track as an interchange with another railroad. So if you are trying to retrofit operations to a railroad that wasn't designed, you're trying to increase your operation flow, look for some of these opportunities just to run a track to the backdrop and have, or through the backdrop. Tony Custer has shown that on his railroad, some that go back behind the backdrop and have huge storage back there for interchange traffic. So staging, we do have our off stage. They can be hidden or out in the open, and they can be fiddled during a session or not. I did visit Lee Nicholas's Utah, Colorado Western, where he has that huge area for the mole, it's called, although you're not really in a mole situation anymore, but just, 6 or 7 tracks and different levels because different tracks come in, and then shelves to store the cars. And there's a guy who spends the whole operating session making up trains in that staging area. Several other, I'm sure people can name a railroad, so that also. Now I've gone with dead staging. I actually only have single track staging, which I'll show you a picture of that. Tony Custer talks about the perfect schematic is like 2 forks with the tongs facing out from each other, going stub to stub. Little space required, but getting your trains turned does, and especially if you have steam locomotives, unless you have a handy turntable or Y available, you got to do some handling of your steam locomotive. I don't find that a big problem. I've gotten used to handling end scale. So my nickel plate 759, I just pick up, do a little flip flop, put it back down, haven't any trouble with it. So different schematics that are out there. Continuous loop is good if you're running loads in one direction and empties in the other. Come on. Here we go. I found the command on the screen. So this is sitting right next to me. I don't know if you actually see me, my video, but to my left is that 5-track staging yard. It's on a 1x6 board, actually 2 boards spliced together. It's about 10 foot long, gives me plenty of storage, an advantage of end scale, just the 1x6. So 10 trains worth of staging pretty easily within a very small space. And yes, I do have to flip flop my coal loads and my empties. I do carry them around a bit, but that's not a problem either. A little easier in N scale than say O scale. Staging can be hidden. So I made a little lift out there rather than having a video camera. I have these little pull outs so I can see what's happening in the Erie Lackawanna staging. There's the nickel plate 759 train. Okay. So I'm a proponent of stub end staging. I even serial stage. So in the Norwich staging yard there'll be 2 trains, one after the other. As long as you're doing a consistent sequence of trains leaving or entering, the serial staging makes, because I had a long, thin space, that works very well for me. Of course, open is better so you can see what's happening. As you saw for my hidden staging, I did have at least the access hatch. I can get up from behind, underneath it. Also at the end of the tracks is a cutout in the fascia, so you can actually look and see what the trains are doing as far as when you're pushing in or pulling out for the end of the track. So I did mention the cons of how to turn locos, especially steam. How do you handle your open top cars? N scale, I didn't find it useful to try to make movable loads. It's just easier to pick up the car and move the whole car. At least I found that. Now, O scale or HO, a lot of people do removable loads. A lot of times they'll put a little piece of metal under the load so you can take a magnet and just pull it off. Wise work is stub end staging, and I've never seen much use of this, but the reverted loop, which is in John Armstrong's Canandaigua Southern Railroad, was in it, was a big space saver, so that rather than running multiple tracks around the return loop, which makes a huge, what they call a blob, this way you can take a train, run it into an empty track, back it around the return loop, and then back it into that empty track. Worked well. I actually saw it in use once. I got to visit. I was very fortunate being in the Navy and being in the NMRA. Like, I was in Monterey, California for Naval Postgraduate School. I did meet a guy, I met folks who operated John Allen's layout. I got to see the basement, got to pick up a few pieces of wood from the lumber stash in the backyard from the burned railroad. A guy there knew John Armstrong. I had to go temporary duty to Washington, D.C. to do a study, and he gave me John Armstrong's address. I wrote, and he's like, yeah, come on over. So I was an O-scaler for about 6 weeks during that temporary duty. I showed him an N-scale locomotive I bought that didn't go over too well. And it was, hey, young kid, I was about 28 at the time, you should be collecting your O-scale equipment now so that when you retire, you can build a railroad. I don't know about that. I've enjoyed having an N-scale railroad from 1982 to present. To fiddle or not, we talked a little bit about, should I sort my cars during an operating session? Now, Lee Nicholas says he never has a problem getting a person to run the fiddle yard. And I know there's another railroad, Grand Trunk, no, I can't think of it. It's a New England model railroad, and the guy never has a problem either getting a person to run the fiddle yard. I don't have a problem with dead end staging. It does require me to do a fair amount of work between operating sessions, but basically it takes me about 4 hours to set up for 6 sequential 2-hour sessions. So I've got a pretty good ratio, about 1 to 3. If it takes, for every 1 hour it takes to set up, I get 3 hours of playtime. I'm halfway in between with the prototype and the freelance is where I've landed, at least. That, yeah, the New York, Ontario, and Western did not exist in 1970. It certainly was not part of Derico, but it's a reasonable story. And it does give me some concept to follow. So it is worth having a story for the railroad. I did give a presentation a while back on also based on a business, what is your why? WHY, not just Y, like a Y track. We do have a guy here who built, he retired, gave a 36-foot by 78-foot track plan to an architect and said, build me a house to fit this. It's a rather interesting, exacting replica of the Baltimore, Ohio old main line, leaving from Baltimore, Maryland, going through Brunswick, Brunswick, Maryland. And his Brunswick, Maryland yard is bigger than most people's home railroads. He gave me the 1949 Historical Society documents. I set up an operating scheme based on that, and we ran it, and it worked perfectly the first time because, he designed his railroad to be a fairly exacting copy of the Baltimore, Ohio. Just a note about fast time. I do only run about a 2-to-1 fast time. Most of the people here only run 2-to-1 fast time. It works, and you don't feel rushed. That's another thing about the fun of an operating session is you shouldn't feel rushed. Time doesn't compress well. We do have automated couplers, so we don't have to connect air hoses, but we also can't kick cars in the yard. And I think we've written about some kicking operations and flying switches. So give the yard crews a chance. Start with your op session with the yard all in good order. Make your yard trackage as easy as possible. Look at what your flow is through the yard. My operations research professor said assume about half the cars for any given train are in the yard on the average waiting. And then if you really get good at it, you can take into account the two standard deviation, best case and worst case. And I really don't do a lot of blocking of outbound trains, and I'm told this is reasonably prototypical. The way freights are really supposed to block their cars at town before they come into the yards. At least they're not completely scattered all over the place. Let's see here. So there's my map. And my Mayfield yard is a little bit off center, but that gives me a lot of local switching. Down here, there is one train that just bounces back and forth between each of the end of lines to Mayfield to try to get all that traffic from upstate down to those interchanges. There's my Syracuse staging. I mentioned the Northwest branch. This is where I'm sitting. It's just to my right. This is a 42-inch wide by 10-foot dormer. And actually, I was about the fourth person to have a contract on the house, and a lot of neighbors had looked at the house and they were always wondering, what would you do with one of these dormers? But it worked out to be just perfect as a dead-end branch for a newbie operator to switch these two big coal breakers. There's a pulpwood track and a little truck loading dock on it. I showed the staging. Oh, there's the in view where you can see where your trains are in the staging. And I do say maximize your length of the flow. Don't put shortcuts in. I think we all know that in this group. And your branches can help by giving newbie operators something to learn from. So hopefully, in talking about this, and many of you, this may be old hat to you, but do think about what is your route from A to B? What are your connections that you're modeling? Make sure you have enough traffic sources to generate your traffic. And of course, we just talked before this about the operating sessions that are being hosted for CROPS. Definitely go to operatingsessions.com. My railroad's on it. You can definitely find places to go practice operations if you're newbie at it. In fact, I've been rather surprised. About 4 people this year have come out of the woodwork saying, well, we just moved south from the north. A lot of people leaving New York State. I know at least 3 people from Rochester, New York, who've abandoned Rochester for South Carolina. And I grew up in upstate New York. My job brought me here and was a good place to semi-retire. But there are always operating experiences out there. I was very lucky. I had a junior high school teacher that hosted a model railroad club with a junior high school, and lo and behold, he allowed us rowdy junior high school students to send upon his Poco Valley Railroad to operate it. So I owe a lot to Ken Nelson, who unfortunately passed in the past year, up from Scotia, New York. And so we have talked about adding car forwarding with the group, looking at your sequence, get some folks together and have some fun. So that is rocks and water flow. I believe we have some time for questions, or Eric, if you saw anything in comments.
Yep. So we've got a few questions. The comments you can look through if you like.
Right.
Do your operators run the trains in and out of staging, or are they handed off to a designated operator representing the next crew district?
Right now, I am going with the operators running it into staging. It seems to work that way. Sydney Yard was originally at the one end was designed to be operated by a yard operator, but there never was enough business. If there was enough people, I might have made, and I still have the plans for it, to put a person that would operate the Sydney Yard, switch the Sydney Industries, and bring the trains in and out of staging at the north end of the railroad. But right now, I just have all the train crews just run their trains in and out of staging.
Okay. Next question from Dave Hussman. That was from Tom Gazier. Dave Hussman asks, have you actually tried the distribution with prototype data? Have found that the Poisson distribution doesn't work as well because the trains and cars are not independent of each other.
Correct. And I would say, if I was really into it, I would do what an operations researcher would do and get that car flows and fit distributions and all that. I mostly use the Poisson as just an idea, and I'm sure this is true for any of the car flows, that as you shrink down your train lengths, the variability proportionally increases significantly. Um, but yes, it would be interesting if I'd had that be an SF job. That would be a real thing I'd have to deal with.
Tom is also asking about the pins on the coal cars.
Yes.
Is just, what are they?
Well, right now, in fact, for the most part, they're thumbtacks. Though to guarantee a certain minimum traffic to each breaker, I actually have put permanently glued paper tabs, or circles like thumbtacks, to the freight cars in some cases, which again, that gets me away from the Poisson distribution, but to make sure that which I believe is prototypical, to make sure that each coal breaker, I shouldn't say mine, they're coal breakers in anthracite world, receive a certain minimum amount of cars. There are some that are permanently stickered for that specific mine. Also, I should say I have a transformer car that always goes to the General Electric plant for refurbishment. So it's actually got a paper white GE on it with a thumbtack hole through it. So once it's delivered to General Electric for loading, I put a thumbtack on it to get it offline. When I restage it from staging, I pull the thumbtack, the GE sticker is showing, so it goes back to the General Electric plant to be tested again, which actually happens in Greenville, South Carolina, by the way, but hey. And my Breakstone, I have a Breakstone yogurt plant in Burn Hills, New York, which is really Walton, and some of the refrigerator cars are permanently in permanent service for that plant. So there's a paper strip on the roof walk that says K3, which is the designator for the refrigerated area at that yogurt plant. And there's a hole in it. So when it's theoretically been loaded at Walton at the Breakstone plant, you put a thumbtack in, it goes to wherever it goes to be unloaded. And when it comes back, you just pull the tack, the red K3 is showing, so it comes back to the Breakstone plant.
All right. Another question, can a layout have too much interchange no matter the size of layout? Would or could it create too much traffic or confusion?
Well, there are, and this is getting very popular. I've operated on a few where they're doing connecting railroad basically, and it's all interchanges. Almost all the traffic is interchange to interchange. I'm trying to think of some of the model railroad names there. You can always have too much traffic for if you have to do classification. It depends on, and you don't necessarily have to even have a classification yard on your modeled railroad. But yes, you do have to, if you're going to do classification of most of your traffic, you've got to keep that, the size of your yard, in balance with the amount of destinations. The other thing too is if let's say, for example, my Central New Jersey interchange is 4 tracks. Now, if I had trouble with getting cars classified, I could just say, stick the Central New Jersey cars on any of the 4 tracks. Let the Central New Jersey deal with it. That's their problem now. Though I do go in with a brown 1, a brown 2, a brown 3, and a brown 4 tack, so that we have to deliver them to the proper tack to the Central New Jersey. So if I was overloaded in the yard and trying to classify by track 1, 2, 3, 4 was too much, I could just go to, okay, fine, just throw them in any of the Central New Jersey tracks. It's their problem now.
Yeah. All right. I don't see any more questions. So.
Well, I could just take if this then is showing.
Yep.
I can at least stand up and say, let me get I gotta get this untangled. I'm gonna
close your eyes, everybody.
Yeah, I just closed the lid there on the camera, so till I can get this thing unknotted from everything else. There we go. All right, so this is the northwest branch. So yeah, that's about 42 inches across. Here's the computer where I've been. So the branch kind of goes above it. To my left is the Norwich 5-track staging yard. and Sydney, New York. Now, I only have so much cable on this camera, but I'll just kind of say this is a bit of a rabbit warren. There's the other, which has, that's where that Delaware River Bridge is, the other dormer. And then just in general, well, for example, there, I think it's showing up, should be the the Scranton with the Central New Jersey interchange.
All right. Hey, there's one more question that popped in.
Okay.
Do you have to do any rebalancing of cars or traffic every so often?
I do a little bit of tweaking. If one thing I did find out was I was running for a while with a lot of excess northbound traffic left at the end of the day. So I did add to the sequence an optional, we called it the Norwich drag, just to get any cars out of Mayfield into Norwich at 3 in the morning, kind of like, get rid of them. There's somebody else's problem. Very rarely does that need to be run. Now, I've done some railroad changes where the Northwest branch picked up a couple of switching jobs in Carbondale, and the primary red local picked up a couple more sidings. So every so often, I do have to run a third version of either the Northwest branch or the red local per day just to handle that traffic. On rare occasions, I'll go into the Excel spreadsheet, which is the Markov chain generator that has all the weighting factors for all the industries and car types. And if I really have a problem, I will tweak on those. And that's a lot easier than removing car cards or adding car cards. So yes, on rare occasions, I've tweaked on things, especially when I bought new cars. I finally have gotten a sufficient number of coal cars. But yes, I can also deal with, an extra train, just call it.
Yep. Okay. All right. Well, Steve, we appreciate you presenting. We had a good crowd tonight. Thank you so much.